Hi everyone, welcome to AZ104 Microsoft Azure Administrator Associate Exam Preparation. My name is Seema Rahman. I'll be walking you through the exam prep course. So let's get started. So in this course, we will talk about how to prepare for AZ104, which is Azure Administrator Prep Work. So our goal for this course will be to take you through the steps of how to prepare for this exam, the entire content, and what does this certification mean. For this particular lesson, we will talk about AZ104 exam and the certification path. We will also talk about the prerequisites and the assumptions that Microsoft is making when they're testing you for this exam. So this is not really a entry level exam. This exam is more of a associate level exam, and we'll talk more about it. And we will also talk about who should take this course. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Seema Rahman. I'm the principal consultant of Zodella Technologies. We provide Microsoft uh, focused cloud technology solutions for industry. I have 20 years of experience in IT, 15 years of which I spent in Microsoft in various roles in support and services organizations. I am also a Microsoft certified trainer. I provide training in Microsoft cloud technologies such as Azure as well as Microsoft 365 technologies. And last but not the least, I'm located in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can connect with me in LinkedIn or you can contact me in my email address that is shown in the screen. Let's now dive into AZ104 exam. This exam is for Microsoft Azure Administrator. So, what does that really mean? This exam focuses on implementing cloud infrastructure technologies. So, you'll be learning more about how to implement a solution. So, for example, you'll be learning about how to implement a directory for your users or how to set up groups for your users. So, the focus in on how to do something, different types of administrative tasks, as well as some troubleshooting tasks that an administrator has to do. It also combines different services of Azure. So, for example, you have the basic Azure directory services, as well as you have the computing services, you have the monitoring services. All of these will be tested with AZ104 exam. The solutions to problems and different types of troubleshooting is also the included in the exam in addition to how to's. However, I think the most important thing to understand is to how to administer the Azure environment. That will be the primary focus of this exam. And last but not the least, it is important to understand that this is a role-based exam. What that really means is that Microsoft has determined its exams as in different categories. So some are focused on different types of roles and some are focused on just the technology itself. So this is a role-based exam, and we'll talk more about that. So um, let's now take a look at the Microsoft certification path, and this will kind of give us some idea of what it means for it to be a role-based exam. So Microsoft certification path is primarily you can either take the fundamental exams, which are the basic exams, and for Azure it is AZ 900. Most of those fundamental exams are have like 900 is the number. Next, you have the specialty type of exams. So there are exams for example, for DevOps, for security. Then you have the role-based exams. And in this role-based exams, you usually have either a associate exam or you have the expert level exam. And the expert level exam usually have the prerequisite, which is to take the associate level exam. And AZ104 is a associate level exam. So In order to understand a little bit more, so you start with the fundamental exam, which is the AZ900, that has the basics of Azure, different types of Azure services and technologies. Next, you have the associate level exam, which is AZ104. And if you pass that exam, you have the certification that you are a Microsoft certified Azure Administrator Associate. And then when you have that associate certification and you pass the exam of AZ305, which is the Microsoft certified Azure Architect exam, then you become an expert level certification, which is AZ305. AZ305 course is available in the Cybrary catalog, just letting you know. AC305 has the prerequisite of AZ104, which we are going to discuss in this live stream event. However, AC104 actually does not have the prerequisite for AZ900. So you can just skip AZ900 and take AZ104 and earn your associate certification. So just showing it you in a different format that if you take AZ104 exam, then you will have the certification of Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator Associate. It does not have any prerequisite. However, if you take AZ104 and AZ305, so then you have the certification of Microsoft Certified Azure Solution Architect Expert, which is an expert level certification, and it requires both AZ104 and AZ305. I hope it doesn't sound too complicated, but that is the zest of it. So let's look at some of the prerequisites. And this prerequisite is really an assumption. So what Microsoft has determined that you already have a some kind of experience, at least kind of like 6 months or so, hands-on experience with Azure. You understand the basic Azure administration, including Azure AD and infrastructure as service, which basically means the administrative console of Azure virtual machines. You have some ideas of Azure databases. You have some exposure to that. Maybe you have used Azure data blob files and whatnot. You know, in general, different types of Azure services. Um, you will earn the certification, as I said, with the Azure Administrator with this exam only. You do not need to have any other certification to earn this. But these are the assumptions that Microsoft is making when you take that exam. So, in a nutshell, what that really means is that in this course and as well as in the exam, we will not have questions or you will not have the content related to what is Azure, what is a Active Directory user. So we will not cover absolute basic stuff. We are going to cover things that are more at associate level. However, as I go through different topics, I will briefly introduce you to the topic and move on to the mid-level content. And during this presentation, if there is something that I'm explaining that the basic is not very clear to you, please post a question and I can most certainly share the resources with you. So before we jump in, in case you're wondering, what does an Azure administrator do? So if you are managing a environment in Azure, what would your day-to-day task look like? First of all, you actually have to deal with a lot of networking technologies. In Azure, the primary networking interface there is the Azure virtual network, but you may have to also work with the on-premise environment if it is integrating with any on-premise environment. You also have to work with the computing technologies. For example, you have to work with the Azure virtual machines. You may have to work with serverless computing solutions such as Kubernetes, or you have to deal with the Azure serverless solutions. You may have to work with different types of storage technologies, and you have to implement solutions that may include security, which is very common in the IT field these days. Everything we do somehow, either directly or indirectly, involves security. Last but not the least, you may have to deal with a lot of business continuity solution. What we mean by that is your basic backup and recovery solution, or your basic redundancy solutions that you have to either implement or manage. You may have to manage a lot of different migrations as well, as your organization is moving different apps to Azure from a different platform. Keeping all that in mind, for this course, our target audience are Azure administrators. Um, that will be the most definitive target audience, or those who are aspiring to become Azure administrators. You may also be an Azure architect and want to learn more about Azure administration. Also, in general, IT consultants, if you are giving Azure related solutions, or if you are giving solutions that involve Azure administration. For example, you could be an IT consultant for Azure applications. However, all Azure applications integrate with Azure Active Directory. Therefore, you need to know a lot about Azure administration as well. So, in a nutshell, if you are seeking to know how to design and administer Azure environment, this is a great certification for you, as well as the content of this course will be very helpful. If you are also someone who is in a IT administration field and you want to dive into Azure, or you're already in Azure but you want to have some sort of certification to advance your career, then this certification along with this course will be very helpful. So we already kind of touched about this, but to put it in perspective, you should take this course simply because it is a role-based certification. Role-based certification actually carry a lot of weight in the Microsoft world, especially in the Microsoft Azure world. If you're already familiar with it, I'm sure you know. Simply because if you are applying for jobs, let's say it's anything related to Microsoft Azure administration, um, it actually is AZ104 is one of the very well known and one of the most sought after certification for those type of roles. As I mentioned before, that AZ900 I believe is a wonderful certification and a wonderful course that is also offered. However, AZ900 is a fundamental course and or a fundamental certificate. It's not a role-based certificate. Role-based certificates are also essential for different Microsoft certified partner organizations. So they also actually have to show that their consultants are certified in different types of Microsoft, technologies that they are offering as solution. So that is why even if you are, let's just say you are working with Azure for 4 or 5 years, you are an expert, you know what you're doing, still there is a lot of value in having the certification because there are a lot of different situations and a lot of different organizations that actually require the Microsoft AZ104 certification. The other thing to keep in mind is that this certification as well as the technologies are talking about practical implementation of different types of Azure solutions that you use every day. So, in case you are hyper focused on, let's just say, Azure Active Directory management and security, you haven't really touched on Azure storage, this is a great way to learn that. This course combines different areas, and it also provides the best practices for different types of implementation. So I think that even if you are a expert in your area, you will learn a lot by taking this course and also by getting certified in this particular exam. Last but not the least, obviously, it will increase your credibility for this particular course. To summarize, we have talked about the exam and the certification path. We have also talked about Microsoft certification path and how this particular exam is helpful in achieving those certification. And also we talked about who should take this exam. Now I'm just going to briefly pause for a couple of minutes or so before moving on to the next presentation, just to see if there are any questions. All right, let's dive into the AZ 104 syllabus and the question distribution. This will be very helpful to understand what to expect from the exam. So in this video, we will talk about what to expect from the exam, the entire exam syllabus. We will also talk about what are the topics and the structure of the courses, and we will also explain how to utilize this course to prepare for the exam. So let's dive in. So first, the exciting topic of what to expect from the exam. First of all, the exam will be 2 hours long, and there'll be like few parts or sections. And I'm just giving you a heads up that if you prepare, and you'll find that 2 hours is plenty of time. Um, I actually have not heard of anyone who said that they were short on time. Um, Still, I don't want to make any assumptions. Just let you know that um, 2 hours is plenty of time for this exam and the type of questions you'll get. So um, don't panic about the time. The questions that you can expect are multiple choice questions. If you are familiar with Microsoft exams, you will probably know that multiple choice questions with Microsoft exams somewhat can be a little bit tricky. What I mean by that is that there could be some drag and drop type of thing uh, questions. So it's not your typical just here's a question, and you have A, B, C, D, and E. Instead, the question can be like, okay, in order to add a user for a particular, let's just say, conditional access rule you created, what are the steps you need to do? So there are 2 steps. You just drag and drop your answer. So which is, I think it's kind of fun, but I'm just setting the stage if you are not familiar with it, that there could be drag and drop type of questions, and then there could be scenario based questions. Now, as I go through these course and talk about different topics, I do have a dedicated chapter at the end where I will only talk about questions. So stay tuned for that if you want to learn more about different types of questions. Now, the total number of questions can be anything between 50 to 70. It's never a set number. So if there are a lot of drag and drop type of questions or scenario based questions, um, there will be less number of questions versus if there are more of your simple multiple choice questions where you're doing just A, B, C, your choices, and it's just one choice. There'll be like more questions. So I the way you Microsoft determines the total number of questions is really dependent on the complexity of the questions. So if there are more complex questions, there will be less number of questions. It's very difficult to determine what is the total number. I'll tell you this though, is that if somebody you're taking this exam next week and your friend tells you that, oh, I had 50 questions, so don't you worry, it's going to be 50. You might be surprised in your exam because you can get a completely different set of questions, and you may end up with 60, 70 questions. And so I want to set the right expectation is that for every day, the questions are kind of randomized. Microsoft has a huge number of question banks. They're randomized for every exam. So for you to get the same set of exam questions or same number of questions as your friend who has taken the exam just a couple of days ahead, the chance of that happening is very slim. So just have that expectation so that you don't panic during the exam, that you can have any number of questions between 50 to 70. And actually this is again a guesstimate. Microsoft does not officially say that total number of questions, so it could be more even. So please keep that in mind. Now, what Microsoft does officially say is that the passing score is 700 out of 1,000. So basically, you have to get 70% of the questions right. So, what are the main topics of AZ 104? The first topic is identity and governance, which basically means Azure Active Directory, users, how do you set up groups, and how do you manage your subscriptions and different types of administrative levels. Then we have the all important topic of Azure Network Infrastructure, which we all know is the one of the most important components of Azure. Then we have Azure Computing Resources, storage solution, which also includes file management. And last but not the least, we have Azure monitoring and backup. And backup also means data protection. So anything that is related to preserving your data and backing up your data is also included. So let's now look at the question distribution. So identity and governance has a 15 to 20% of the weight. Implementing and managing storage, same 15 to 20%. Compute solution is 20 to 25%. Configuring and managing network is 25 to 30%. So most weight is given in that. And monitoring and data protection is 10 to 15%. So this can be a little bit deceptive if you are again not familiar with Microsoft exams. So it's not going to be, the questions are not going to be that 30% of the question is strictly about Microsoft Virtual Network. What Microsoft really means when they give you this weight is that in order to answer a question, you have to know Microsoft Virtual Network, for 30% of the question. So a question can be really about something else. So for example, it could be that um, that the question says that there is a VNet connection between your Azure Active Directory and on-premise directory, and then let's say certain objects got replicated to Azure AD, and what should you expect? So it could be about Azure Active Directory, but if you do not understand VNet and how it works in hybrid environment, then it'll be difficult for you to really understand the question. So this is what the exam topics and weight really mean, is that um, this is not really about direct question. It is more about how directly or indirectly certain technologies get are featured in the questions. So just keep that in mind. So as you see, the biggest takeaway from this question distribution is that you really have to put your focus on all the topics that are covered, right? Because you have to get 70% of the questions right to get the certification. And then you can expect that the questions will be, all the questions will feature um, the network of certain organization, the computing resource. Let's just say there will be a lot of questions related to virtual machines. So there'll be questions related to storage, let's just say 1 out of 5 times. So these are the kind of things that you need to keep in mind. So, with that in mind, with this course, we are going to focus as we are doing. Module 1 will be just introduction. So, we are not actually going to look at the actual content. It's just introducing you to the exam and what to expect. In our Module 2, we'll talk about identity and governance. Module 3 will be more about management. So, that also will cover governance. Module 4 will be dedicated with network. Module 5 will have data storage. Then we'll talk about virtual machines, app and containers. data protection, monitoring, and we'll conclude with some more tips on exam prep and Q&A. So with this live stream, we have 4 days for this course. And on day one, which is today, we are going to cover identity and access management. We'll cover governance and also just basic administration and management features with Azure. In day two, we will cover networking and storage. In day three, we will cover virtual machines and app services. And on our last day, we will talk about containers, data protection, and monitoring. And what I have not put in this presentation is that on our last day, we will also talk about some of the exam prep tips and tricks and answer all your questions that we have not answered throughout the day. So with this course, as well as by taking this exam, what is the learning outcome that you are supposed to um, get from this course is that we are going to walk you through the steps of implementing identity and access management. We'll also talk about governance, which basically means that how to manage your Azure services and subscriptions and some of the best practices. You will also learn about implementing data storage using either blob storage or file sync. We'll talk about virtual machines, different app services, and Kubernetes. And also, we will talk about monitoring log analytics. When it comes to networking, in addition to creating virtual network and your IP address schemes, we'll talk about DNS and network security groups and different types of network traffic and routing. We'll also talk about designing backup and data protection solution for your file folders as well as virtual machines. For the Cybrary course, the course materials that are going to help you with this particular exam are going to be the content of the course, which is the syllabus. We'll have study guides. We'll have different types of reference materials and assessments and case studies for this particular exam. So how do you utilize this course? Here are some of the key points. First and foremost, we this is absolutely the up-to-date content that I'm talking about when I walked you through the course topics as well as the question distribution. However, it is very possible that you are watching this today and you have maybe planned to take this exam sometime in spring. And between now and then, the course content may get updated by Microsoft. Therefore, my suggestion is that always check the Microsoft exam site for the latest course content, just to make sure that you have covered all the course content. For example, like a year ago, it could be even longer. The log analytics application was not actually part of the AC 104 exam. And then it is added sometimes in last 6 to 8 months, if I'm not mistaken. So as Microsoft is adding more and more services in Azure, they are also adding more and more content. What I can tell you is that Microsoft will not add content or services or technologies that are in beta. Usually, they will add content that are already in use for a while and has become an essential part of administering Azure. So please keep your eyes out for the latest content. I cannot stress this enough because I know folks who have been surprised when they sit for this exam when they see newer content. So you should check for the content before your exam, right before your exam, and it'll tell you because they have a link, and I'll demo that for you. They have a link, and in that link, actually, it just gives you a change log as to when the content has updated. Keep in mind that the focus of this course is to configure and manage. So therefore, you have to understand infrastructure. If you haven't, as you focus on the content of this course, the important thing to understand is that when we are talking about an organization and they have a on-premise domain and then they have a Azure service, can you visualize their infrastructure? It is very important to understand that, simply because that will help you understand the questions that are presented in the exam. Next, I would say that after understanding the infrastructure, you also have to understand the requirement. So the questions are usually presented in this way, that this is the infrastructure of this environment, and the administrator is trying to come up with a backup solution. So do you understand the requirement? Um, so in order to do that, I always recommend trying to have a hands-on lab. You can have your own lab to basically practice or just to understand the Azure interface. I would highly recommend just creating a free Azure account and then just look at the Azure AD interface, just to get yourself familiarized with in the for the questions in the exam. So, how can you utilize this course? I think the best way to utilize this course, or any course for that matter, is to use the course as your guideline. It is very difficult to cover every single topic, like from definition to implementation steps to best practices in one course, even if that course is a 5-day course. So there are a lot of details that are presented in the Microsoft documentation. So it can be, just you go to Microsoft.com, and then, you can search for different topics that you want to learn. Also, speaking of learn, if you go to learn.microsoft.com, and you can search for either topics or even this exam, and Microsoft actually has, in a very well organized way, presented different types of topics. And then on those topics, you have tutorial and labs. So we have a question. The question is, that I really want to learn and land in new career. How can you help me? All right. So definitely want to when the question comes in, I really want to learn. I'm just assuming you want to learn Azure and you want to land a new career that involves Azure. I would say that you're in the right track, that you are, tuning in into this stream. So basically, we will dive into the AZ-104, and we will talk about all the topics. I think that in a nutshell, I would say that if you want to learn and land a new career, and let's just say you are new in Azure, I don't know any of the background or anything like that, I would say that just going into these live streams, as well as Microsoft, um, there are some Microsoft events as well, is a good place to start. And in order to have a career in Azure, let's say as an Azure admin, or maybe you want to have start your career as someone who is supporting Azure. All of those can be very achievable with a certification. I think that if you do not have any long-standing experience, certification is a way to showcase that you are interested in learning, as well as you are really vested in learning the topic, and you are certified that you actually have accomplished learning Microsoft Azure. So those are my suggestions. So in a nutshell, enjoy this live stream event for all 4 days, as well as keep your eyes out for other live stream events, and then prepare yourself for certification. All right. So to summarize, in this video, we covered the exam content and the question distribution. We also talked about the course structure, how these 4 days of live stream event will go. And we also talk about how to utilize this course is to use it as a guideline and how it can help you to prepare for this exam. Now, with that being said, I will pause for some Q&A and and before I jump into the main content. All right. So now we are going to talk about the actual content of AZ 104 exam. So let's dive in. As we mentioned before, AZ 104 is for administering your Azure environment. When we talk about administration, what that really means is that you will be doing lot of stuff within Azure. You will be managing your users, you'll be creating um, new users, new virtual machines, new solutions, and all of these. As you do it, you have to keep your eyes out for what is your backup solution. Where are you doing all this? Where is it actually going? Where does this all live? These are important questions to ask simply because when you are in an IT environment, your network connectivity, your availability, everything depends on understanding the physical infrastructure of Azure environment. And that is what we are going to start with. Let's look at Azure Global Infrastructure. So, with this particular lesson, we are going to review a very quick and brief review of Azure Global Infrastructure. And this is definitely going to help you understand your Azure, where does your stuff actually is. I mean, it is in some server and your users are obviously stored somewhere. And why do you need to know this? Number one reason you need to know this is as rare as it is, but things still can go down. What I mean by that there are outages in any cloud service. And whenever there are outages, when you get notification from Microsoft, they will say that Microsoft East region, you know, is currently experiencing outage or slowness. So you need to know, are you in East region or are you in US West, all this kind of stuff. So in order to really understand Microsoft notification, you need to know um, and have a good idea about Microsoft Global Infrastructure. In order to have any type of backup and any type of redundancy solution, you need to understand the global infrastructure. And having a data protection or is part of AZ 104, although I have to admit AZ 104 is not heavy on building redundancy solution, but I think that it is extremely important that you understand and you build a redundancy solution for your environment as you're administering an environment. All right, so let's dive in. So when we talk about Azure Global Infrastructure, what we mean is that Azure is really comprised of data centers. So what Microsoft has really done is that they have created data centers that are spread out throughout this world. Just for sake of explaining things, since I'm located in US, I'll talk about US a little bit more. So in US, for example, the data centers are located in US East Coast, West Coast, and also obviously spread out throughout the center, US, Midwest, and those region. But most of the data centers are in East Coast and West Coast for obvious reasons, since most organizations and most population are in US East Coast and West Coast. In case you're wondering, Microsoft never really publishes the actual address of the data center for security reasons. What they publish is the region and approximate location based on the city. So, for example, if I mean, if I just search and say like I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, it'll give me the location of the nearest data center for Charlotte, North Carolina. So Azure data centers, what is a data center? In a nutshell, it's not really specific to Azure, but we are talking about Azure. Data centers can be very similar for Amazon and Google as well. These are physical buildings that have thousands of literally servers and server racks, which is basically your infrastructure, and these data centers are connected to each other, as well as they're connected to central WAN location, where sometimes where not only you can connect, but also there are a lot of third-party vendors who provide private connection to Azure through ExpressRoute. They can connect as well. So basically, it's comprised. The infrastructure has servers as well as network connectivity. That's what you need to know. All right. Um, So again, going back, every geographical location contains one or more region. So for example, if you look at US, US will have um, regions. Even in US East actually has US East 1, US East 2. So they have multiple regions in US East, but they basically divide up. If there is a bigger country like US, where there are a lot of subscribers, and um, there are a lot of heavy Azure users, you have different regions, and each region will have at least two or more data centers. Within each region, Azure has something called availability zones, which are unique uh, physical location. Availability zones actually really come into play when you are having basically coming up with the high availability solution for your Azure application, or in general your Azure environment. So basically, it is a unique physical location which guarantees a high uptime. So now that we understand about the physical location of Azure, let's dive into our actual content, which is Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is, I would say, the core foundation of Azure, and we will first have an overview of Azure Active Directory. So our goal is to understand the how Azure Active Directory works and what is the main purpose of Azure Active Directory. We will also talk about the key features of Azure Active Directory. And last but not the least, we will understand the purpose of Azure Active Directory and how it provides identity and access management. So Azure Active Directory is in a nutshell, the standard definition is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management solution. What it really means is that it gives you a directory which provides you with features for authentication and authorization of different resources. So if I want to, basically elaborate on that, what it really means is that you have a directory where you have just the basic stuff, such as you have list of users and groups, and when your user signs in, basically they are authenticating against this directory infrastructure. So you create your user, you set up your user's password, you set up your user's password length and complexity in this particular interface called Azure AD. So the key features of Azure AD is that it provides a identity and access management platform. IAM, just FYI, is a really industry standard terminology. It's not specific to Azure. What that really means is that what is the platform that provides users access? What is the platform that provides access to other resources? And for Azure, it is Azure AD or Azure Active Directory. This also provides a way for basically providing identity security. A very simple example is obviously password, but Azure AD is so much more than just providing username and password. With Azure AD, you can create multi-factor, you can create different types of conditional access. For example, you can even you can set things like this is my known network and I'm only going to allow users to access Azure or any of my resources from this particular network. You can control your enterprise access, which basically means that, let's say you have something called a application, and this application has some specific access requirement. Only this can be accessed, let's just say, by accountants of your organization. You can set up those type of access using Azure AD. You can create collaboration and development. For example, all of Microsoft 365 users and different features are actually integrated with Azure AD. So when you're using, let's just say, collaborative apps such as Microsoft Teams, you go to Azure AD to set up different security features with Microsoft Teams as well as different collaborative features. Um, you can also set up identity integration via Azure AD and using ADFS, which is Azure's federation solution. So what that really means is that you can have a intermediate type of servers that integrates Azure AD with a third-party app. A very simple example of that is that if you in your organization you sign in, and then you can use that same sign in to log into, let's just say, a human resources app where you set up your payroll and stuff, which is actually hosted by not even hosted by Microsoft or Azure. It's a completely different third party application. And all of these identity integration is achieved using Azure AD, and then some federation app that is intermediate, and then it connects to a third party directory. So many features, and we are going to highlight some of the key features in this presentation. So for those of you who are familiar with Active Directory on-premise, Azure AD will be a breeze because it is very similar to on-premise Active Directory. So for those of you who are not familiar, is that Microsoft on-premise solution also has directory using which it provides identity and access management. It is called Active Directory, and obviously it is, I don't know, you can think of it as the V1 of directory management system, and Azure AD is V2 or the cloud version of that. However, there are differences with on-premise Active Directory. In on-premise Active Directory, you have something called organizational units and group policy objects, which Azure AD does not have. Azure AD does support software as a service app authentication natively, which you don't have with on-premise Active Directory. It does require ADFS on-premise to do software as service app authentication. On-premise Active Directory has a hierarchical structure, which is the key difference actually between Azure AD and on-premise, and Azure AD does not. So in case you're wondering, Azure AD, why does it have a flat structure? Um, Azure AD is really, as we talked about a couple of slide decks back, that Microsoft has a infrastructure which is basically uh, a lot of servers and a lot of networking connection to provide this cloud service, right? So when you create your first Azure tenant, you have identity, or your organization is called myorg.onmicrosoft.com. Okay. So on Microsoft.com is actually Microsoft's the top level directory, and from there it kind of like gives everyone, whoever wants to subscribe to Azure, a little piece of that directory, which is Azure AD. Of course, it ensures that every little piece of directory is completely segregated. There is no interaction or no connection or anything, for security and all other purposes. But that is why it has a flat structure, simply because it is all it's doing is, there is a mega directory somewhere out there called on Microsoft.com, and you have a piece of that directory when you create your cloud directory in Azure. And that is why it is a flat structure, because that's how it has to be, in order you are actually getting just a little piece of an existing directory. So that is why it's flat, as well as it has all these other built-in features, whereas on-premise Active Directory is hierarchical in nature. For example, you have myorg.com, and then let's just say you add a new office in Charlotte, and you can call it, it's a new domain, you can call it charlotte.mydomain.com, things like that. So lots of differences, but there are a lot of familiarities too. So it always helps to know on-premise Active Directory as well. So before we dive into identity and access management, it's good to know, what do we mean by identity and access management? What it really means is that um, with identity and access management, we will define different roles and accesses for different users known as individuals. And these individuals can be employees, or part of your organization, or these individuals can be what we call guest users, users that are external to your organization. You can even manage that access using Azure AD as well. So the identity and access management basically defines roles, and then it also defines the privileges of different roles, and it can manage internal and external users. With identity and access management, not only you can define different levels of access, but you can also actually define different um, basically different types of application that have access. So for example, with IAM, you can set up your access for Microsoft SharePoint. You can set up your access for Microsoft Teams. You can even set up access for, let's just say, different resources and file shares with certain times. So for example, you can set up access with different types of files only during weekdays during 9 to 5, so that you know that your files are not being accessed during off hours, or which reduces your chances of those files getting compromised. So all of these can be controlled using a identity management. When you control all of these different levels of access, it also provides you with features that helps you to stay in compliance. For different organizations, for example, if you're in the healthcare industry, or if you are in the financial industry, there are different compliances that is applicable to your industry that you have to abide by. With Azure AD, you can do that. As a matter of fact, Azure AD and also Microsoft Compliance has a lot of built-in templates that can help you stay in compliance. So we talked about identity and access management. So what is the fundamental components of identity and access management? We can divide the component into three parts. You have the principal, you have the identity, you have the authorization. principal means that the entity that is trying to access. So, for example, you just received a link to a file share and you are trying to access. As before you authenticate, you are known as the principal who was trying to access this file share. And then when you're trying to access this file share, you get a pop-up that says that, oh, you have to enter your username and password. So you enter your username and password. At that point, you have provided the identity. So an authenticated entity is actually known as the identity of a specific principal. Once you have provided the identity, then basically the environment or the identity and access management checks if this particular identity that has just been authenticated have access to this particular file. And it, if you do have access, you will be able to access that file, and that particular task is known as authorization. So as we go by, when we talk about identity and authorization, that is what we mean. Identity means an authenticated entity, and authorization means that you have access or permission to certain resources. To summarize in this video, we covered the basics of Azure AD. We also covered different features of Azure AD. We talked about differences of Azure AD with on-premise AD. And we also talked about the principles of identity and access management. With that in mind, I'll just pause for a second to see if there are any questions. Hi everyone, we are back with the presentation for AZ104, preparing for AZ104 exam. In this module, we'll talk about tenant management. In case you were waiting, I apologize for any delays. We will now move forward with the presentation. So we talked about Azure AD and the difference between Azure AD as well as on-premise AD. So now we'll talk briefly about Tenant and how it correlates with Azure AD. So our goal is to understand what it means in Azure to have an Azure tenant. And then we'll talk about Azure tenant and subscription because those two terminologies at times can get confusing. So Azure tenant is really a what we call a your organization's identity. So when you are first creating a tenant, what you have to do in Azure is you have to set up an account. When you set up an account, a tenant is automatically created for you. Azure Tenant is really the first part of your Microsoft Azure identity. I already talked about Microsoft Azure's overall Active Directory being on Microsoft.com. So let's just say you created a identity called admin at mycompany.onmicrosoft.com. In that case, my company is the tenant where you belong and you just created with your admin account. Now, this particular tenant is nothing but your instance of Azure AD, and this is where you're going to organize or create your users and groups. Now, when you first create a account, you are creating a subscription by default with this account. That subscription is directly correlated with your tenant. Tenants have a one-to-many relationship with subscription. So, what do I mean by that? What that really means is that when you have first created your tenant, it will be associated with a subscription that comes with creating your account. After that, you can create other subscriptions within that tenant. So let's first look at the life cycle as to how first subscription gets created. You sign up for a Azure account. So you will go to azure.com and you'll sign up for an account. When you sign up for the account, let's just say, as I said, it could be your name at mycompany.onmicrosoft.com. So anytime you put in like my company, like it'll ask you name your domain, you'll say my company or my organization, whatever. It is automatically going to add on Microsoft.com because that is Microsoft's backend, the mega uh, Active Directory or identity interface they have. So everything gets created on top of on Microsoft.com. So Azure will create your Azure AD tenant, and this is what you're going to use for your users. With this tenant, Azure also creates a subscription, and you can organize all your cloud services related to your particular organization or a particular project. You can think of it as a logical container for your billing and security purposes. Once you have your Azure subscription, you can deploy other cloud services with this subscription, such as virtual machines, virtual network, blobs, and etc. Now, what if you are the administrator and your only job is to manage the Azure AD and stuff? Let's say there is a completely separate department that manages your customer facing web service and you want that web service to be hosted in Azure. Well, now you can actually create a separate subscription. And with that subscription can be attached to the virtual machines or any other apps that is related to that web service. And that particular subscription can be managed by a completely separate team. So you're not responsible for that. This is why For the purpose of management as well as for billing purposes, multiple subscriptions are useful. And you can create multiple subscriptions within the same tenant. So if we look at the diagram here, we can see that you have a Azure tenant and you have two different subscription. You have the first subscription that has only access to directory, and basically it is used for just managing directory. And you have the second subscription that manages directory as well as maybe some other apps, or the second subscription just manages apps and the main management of the directory is still with the first subscription. Keep in mind that since it is pointing to the same tenant, just by creating a second subscription does not mean that you have whole another Azure AD. It's still the same Azure AD. It is managed by the first subscription, but your second subscription is only related to the apps that you want to manage. However, those apps do link back to the main directory that was created. Now, question comes then, who is going to manage the access to that app? Well, it's going to be, you can use role-based access that we are going to talk about uh, in our upcoming slides, but it can be managed by both or either. So you can actually give access to manage your all your app related activity that can be given by the global admin who is related with Azure Subscription 1, and or it can be managed by the global admin from using the Azure Subscription 1, and whoever is managing the subscription to has no access, or global admin there can give access to the person who's managing subscription to manage everything related to this app. So it can be done either or. Keep in mind that this is all relating back to the same Azure AD tenant, which means that it is all relating back to the same Azure AD. So as we said before, that you first log in with the Azure account, and that default account also becomes the default global admin, is related to your Azure AD tenant, and you create multiple subscription. However, let's just say you create a Azure AD account, and then it has a subscription. Can you just then add another tenant to it? The answer is no. You cannot add multiple tenant to a single Azure subscription. So just to summarize that, what we talked about in this video is the tenant to directory to subscription relationship. And we will dive more into this when we talk about governance, which has basically resource groups and management groups. But just to summarize, we use tenants to organize users and groups because tenants is kind of like another name you can think of the Azure AD instance that your organization has. Tenants can have multiple subscriptions, and these subscriptions can be used just to better manage your organization's billing as well as other features. However, you cannot have multiple tenants within one subscription. Let's now dive into managing users and groups. Before that, I'm just going to pause a second to see if there are any questions with regards to tenants. All right, I think that we are still waiting for questions and stuff. I'll move forward with this presentation. If you have any questions with regards to tenants and subscriptions, please feel free to ask those questions anytime during this presentation. We will now move forward to managing users and groups in Azure. So in this presentation, we will talk about what it is that we can manage as far as users and groups are concerned. What is Azure users? How are they Azure AD users? How are they same or are they different than on-premise AD users that we are familiar with? You'll also learn about the JSON objects that are used to manage the user permission. You'll also learn different ways to create Azure user. We'll also talk about different types of groups and its member types. So Azure AD users are actually identities or um, what we talked about users in Azure AD tenant, which is again an instance of Azure Active Directory for your organization. By default, all the members have a default user permissions. These user permissions are basically, user can sign in, user can have certain attributes that they can change, user can have access to some default features, such as a they actually do have access to default read-only copy of Azure AD, just so you know. So the reason user have default directory access is that when you give access to the user to other applications so that they have access to the directory. So for example, if you users have access to Microsoft Exchange email service, then you don't have to go through the extra steps of creating directory access and whatnot. They have access to directory. So these identities, what happens when you create Azure user is that it is created with some JSON objects, and these objects have certain attributes. For example, by default, the account is created as enabled. There is attribute called department display name. There's job title. These are just some fun items we put together as JSON objects. You'll have the user's locations, but most importantly to keep in mind is that you will get a UPN, and this UPN is your user's display name or at the rate of your company name dot on microsoft.com. That is your entire UPN. So your Azure AD UPN will always have your organization's tenant ID, which is your organization dot on microsoft.com. And you'll have a user type as well. So if you want to create you an account that is created as account disabled, a lot of people want to do that. They want to create all the account as disabled and come back at a later time to enable this account. In that case, you'll just have to create a template first in Azure AD. It's really UI based, very easy to use. And from that template, you will create, you'll make sure that the accounts are created as disabled. So let's look at some of the user types by default. First user types are administrators. There are two different types of administrators. First is the global admin. I told you that when you first create a Azure tenant, the user by default is a global admin. There has to be an admin that has access to everything to configure as well as set up things, and that is the global admin. You can later add other users and make them global admin. Just so you know, from security perspective, Microsoft do recommend not to have more than 5 global admins. This is where you have other admins, and these admins can be user admins, they can be device admins. There are all these other pre-built admin roles for different apps that you can give your users or your regular admins access to. All right, then you have member users. These are standard users, and the standard user permissions are given to these member users. Member users can manage some of their own identity properties, and also if the tenant at tenant level, you are allowing guest users, then member users uh, can basically invite guest users. So what that really means that if at tenant level you are allowing, let's just say, guest user access, and you can allow guest user access to all guest users, or you can actually specify guest user access to certain domains. So if you are partnering with, some other company.com and, company2.com, you can specify that, oh, I'm going to allow guest user and I'm going to allow only from these companies. Then your users, member users, can basically invite those guest users. Um, Speaking of guest users, this is the third type of users we have. These are the users that are outside your organizations when you temporarily invite them in your Azure AD resource. So, for example, from Teams, you have a Teams channel, and in that channel, you want to collaborate with Company 2, which is your partner company, and you are inviting guest users from that company. So there will be an identity created for that guest users from the other companies, since you are company or organization, since you are inviting them, and that is the guest user identity. That identity will be given access to collaborate within the organization. There are a lot of access control that administrator can do. So for example, administrators can already set up some default access for guest user and prevent guest users from doing some things like accessing internal files. Um, in that instance, even a member user who invited the guest user cannot give them that level of access. So there's all kinds of fun stuff and as well as security stuff you can do with guest users. So now that we talked about users, let's look at what are the methods for creating users. Well, first and the most commonly used method is using the Azure portal. If you're a smaller organization or you're managing a smaller organization, or perhaps you already have all your users created by some app or by through synchronization, and you just add one or two users every now and then using the Azure portal is the most convenient way to create users. Next is creating PowerShell. This is basically, you're all probably familiar with PowerShell. This is Microsoft's command line tool. You can use the new dash Azure AD user to create user. Last but not the least, I think it's the least popular way of creating users is using the Azure CLI or Azure command line interface. You will use the command AZ AD user create to create users. Now that we talked about users, let's now talk about groups. What are groups? So, groups are containers for managing Azure AD users. We are, I think, all very familiar with the concept of groups. You can group users based on their job function or based on their location, based on anything that you can think of that helps you manage your users. You can use these groups to grant access, or you can use these groups to give permissions. When you are using groups to basically give permissions, there is the Microsoft recommendation of implementing list privilege principle. And we'll talk about list privilege principle as we move on. But just so you know, is that if you are giving access using groups, and let's say in the group of users, you think like, well, this one user might need write access, but all the users just need read only access, then what you should the access that you should give is read only. There is a chain of thought, uh, or there is a thought process, you can say. Sometimes people may think that, well, I'll give more access just in case somebody needs access, because I don't want them to open help desk ticket or come back with hey, I need more access, that type of thing. But actually, when you think about security, that is not a good practice. Actually, this is really, really um, emphasized by Microsoft as well as all security practitioners to give least possible privilege when you are giving access, especially when you're giving access to a group, because you don't really necessarily always pay attention to who are the members. So that's why be very careful when you are giving access to a group. So let's look at membership and group types. So let's first look at group types. We talked about security groups. These groups are used to manage access and to share resources for a group of users. So security groups are very much similar to security groups that we know about from on-premise Active Directory. Basically, you create a group and it'll ask you what type of group you want to create. And that type of group is security group. You'll choose the security group and then you can use the group to give access. Next type of group is Microsoft 365 group. Microsoft 365 group has similar features, but actually a lot more. You can actually use Microsoft 365 group to give application specific features and access, such as giving access to mailboxes, calendars, files, as well as you're going to use Microsoft 365 groups to give access to a lot of Teams resources, SharePoint resources. So it is very app focused. When you create a Microsoft Teams channel, for example, you are actually um, creating let's take a step back. When you are creating a Microsoft Teams group, which may have multiple channels, in the back end, what it actually creates is a Microsoft 365 group. And also, it creates a SharePoint site, and also it creates a mailbox for that entire group. So Microsoft 365 group is deeply integrated with different types of Microsoft applications, such as Microsoft Teams, as well as other applications such as SharePoint. And using Microsoft Groups, it is easier to give access and manage different features. So this is also key thing to remember, and also key thing to keep an eye out, because let's just say you just manage just the Active Directory side of things, and there is another person who manages your O365 applications, and they ask you to create a group. Make sure to ask them what type of group you need to create, because there are certain instances, if you create just a regular security group, it will not work with certain applications. Let's look at member type. This is There can be three different types of member type. One is assigned. Uh, this is where you create a group. This is like the what I call the old school way. You create a group and then you go into the members tab and you search and add members specifically. Uh, the second type of member is dynamic users. In this case, you are automatically adding users based on certain attributes or based on certain events. So, for example, you can have a corporate all user group. So, whenever a user gets added to Azure Active Directory, they automatically get assigned to that all users group, so that that group is used to track all the users. You can have a user group which is based on the user's title, or it is based on the user's department. For example, all users in the sales department are in a group. Similar concept also applies to dynamic device. Automatically, a device is added to the group based on event triggers or changes. Let's now take a different look at another feature of Azure AD, which is the self-service password reset. Um, we talked about managing password or managing security as one of the key features of Azure AD. Now, how are you going to reset your password when your password expires. Azure AD provides a self-service password reset feature. Basically, once you enable it from Azure AD, you can send the link to all your users, and your users will get a notification when their password is about to expire, and they can use that link to go and reset their password. You can also do this for a select group of users. Um, Also, you can choose what type of notification you will send to your users. So, in other words, you can customize the type of notification in this self service password reset feature or the app that you have with Azure AD. So in this video, we talked about Azure AD users and groups and how Azure AD users and groups are used to limit permissions. We talked about JSON object real quick. We also talked about different type of group membership types as well as different types of groups. So with that in mind, let's see if you have any questions. All right. I don't think we have any questions yet for this, so just give me a moment and I will start the next presentation. So we talked about managing users and we talked about Azure Active Directory. One of the key components of any IT infrastructure are devices that users are using. So how do you manage these devices? We'll take a look at that. Managing devices is a key part of Azure AD. We will talk about how the basics of device identity is managed by Azure AD. We'll talk about the device registration options. We will also explore something called conditional access with regards to managing devices. Let's talk about device identity. Device identity, what we really mean by that is a device that is already present in your Azure AD. If you already have a device that is presented, which basically means registered or authenticated in your Active Directory, then providing security for that device is much easier than if the device is non-existent in Active Directory. What I mean by that is that that device now has identity, aka it's a authenticated entity. That that way, we can now control the data and the resources and assets that can be accessed by this particular device. You can create a framework for managing this device. One of the ways to do that is what we call a device based conditional access. You can gain control of how different teams and also different users uh, can access critical resources using conditional access. So, for example, you create conditional access so that the devices that belong to, let's just say, your accounting department can have access to certain financial data. In order to provide device management, there is a service called Microsoft Intune. Intune can give you many features of managing devices. First of all, Intune gives you the interface to register the devices, which we will talk about. It also gives you the features to manage different security and compliance requirements. So, for example, you can set up different policies within Intune to manage your devices. So, one of the very common policy that everyone creates in Intune and which should be part of your management policy is checking for Windows updates. So you can create a policy that all your devices should have Windows updates, should install Windows Update within 30 days of release of Windows Update, so that all the devices are up to date. So this is one of the most well-known policy. Other policies can also incorporate other updates, such as app-specific updates for Edge or even Google, Chrome, as well as other apps. So let's look at device registration options. You have device registration options. What we mean by that is that how do you get a device to show up in your Active Directory? So first option is Azure AD registered. What that really means is that you have bought your own device. Usually that is the case, uh, and the device is uh, present in your in the Azure AD. However, it is marked as BYOD, basically bring your own device, and it is Azure AD registered, but it is list restrictive, which means that there are lot of Intune policies that cannot be applied to those devices. Then you have Azure AD joined. Azure AD joined means that these are corporate office or corporate owned devices, um, and and the users access the Azure AD. Users basically have to access Azure AD. So basically, they go to the devices, and then when they sign in, they are actually signing into Azure AD to log in. So you cannot have, your Hotmail ID or something to log into the device if you're using a Windows system. When you have a Azure AD joined device, basically you are using your corporate identity to log into the device. Very similar to on-premise Active Directory joined device. So in case of Azure AD joint device, the device identity exists only in the cloud. To keep in mind that it is only supported Windows 10 or and later, and Windows 2019 server grade machine or later devices. Last but not the least, we have hybrid Azure AD joint devices. In this case, devices are owned by the organization. You're still using Azure AD account, but the device identity can belong to either Azure AD or Active Directory on-premise. So you can have your domain joined machine, which is your work machine, and let's just say your on-premise Active Directory is now connected to Azure AD. In that case, it will be your device will be known as hybrid Azure AD joined machine. And in that case, actually, some of the older versions of Windows machine is supported. Let's now talk about conditional access. So you can control the access of devices. In other words, which devices are you going to let be registered or be present in your Azure AD, or which devices are you going to let access to your, let's just say any app, let's just say your application, email application, your collaboration application. So you can set up conditional access where you are checking username and password to first make sure if the user is authenticated. However, what if somehow users authentication information was compromised? That's why having device also authenticated or validated or at least controlled using conditional access is a good security measure. And you can set up conditional access based on users group or membership, and then you set up the access like IP location. So if a device is trying to connect, you can set up IP locations such as your office network. So if a device user comes into their office with their laptop and they're joined to their internal network, maybe they have access to certain things which they don't have access to from their home network. And you can set up the different types of compliance state for that device, and you can set up that what type of application they can access from the device based on their connectivity. While you're doing all that, um, Azure actually does real time monitoring and calculates the risk detection. So, what that really means is that, let's just say someone is trying to actually, for lack of better words, hack into your system. They're trying, maybe they have a application or VPN type where they're putting in different types of IPs to try to connect to your environment, try to fool the system, thinking that it's connecting through internal network. So all this type of different trial and error, or if they have additional network stack present in that device, can be detected by Microsoft's cloud risk detection system, and it actually scores the user or the device. And based on the risk detection level, you can set up policy. For example, if the risk detection is like at a medium level, you can set up a policy that the device cannot access. So in other words, if you set up a policy the device cannot access, it also means obviously it applies to the user too, that the user using the device cannot access your environment. So you can do that. And you have the Microsoft Cloud Application Security that actually monitors the user sessions and application access doing that. To summarize, in this video, we covered basics of device identity in Azure. We also talked about different types of ways devices can be registered, and we talked about access control for devices that are connected to Azure. I'm just pausing for a second just to see if there are any questions. All right. Since I'm not seeing any questions, I'm just going to move forward with Azure AD Join, our next presentation. So let's now talk about Azure AD Join. We know briefly about, we talked about briefly about joining your device to Azure Active Directory, similar ways to joining your device in on-premise Active Directory. So we'll dig deep into Azure AD Join feature. We'll learn about how Azure AD Join works, and we'll also talk about device setting requirements for Azure AD Join. So Azure AD Join, what that really means is that granting the users the ability to join a device in Azure using their identity. So for example, you give a user a username and password, the user can authenticate and against your Azure Active Directory. On top of it, you have to give the user the permission to make sure that not only the user can join Azure Active Directory, but user can also register the device in Azure Active Directory. The process of registering the device in this case will be joining the device to Azure AD. And in that case, it will be assigned a tenant using the credential of the user account. So device will have a identity such as device1.yourcompany.onmicrosoft.com. So let's take a look at this diagram. What happens here is that, let's say the user first logs into the device, and user uses their organization's account to log into the device. And then there comes an option to register the device to Azure Active Directory. And once the user registered the device to Azure Active Directory, the device is joined. And from that point forward, user will always log into the device using the organization account. So what happens when you join a device to Azure Active Directory? First of all, you have to give the user permission to add devices to Azure AD. Usually, when you grant this permission using Intune, you actually can choose a number. So you can choose like 5 devices or 10 devices, but 10 does seem a bit much. Standard practice is usually 5 devices. And also you can choose whether it's just a regular device, meaning whether it's a PC or whether it's a mobile device. Um, you can select users to be the local admin. This is basically user will become a local admin when you use Intune. The reason is that the user account is used to set permission or basically grant permission within the device. So, for example, um, let's say your device identity needs to be validated to access an application. So, for that purpose, your device needs to have certain permission assigned within the workstation's operating system. That permissions are assigned using your own user account. So your own user account has to be the local admin. That is how Intune works. However, in order to do that, you do need Azure AD Premium subscription. So when you subscribe to Azure AD, you have Azure AD Basic, then you have another subscription, um, one level up. Obviously, if it's not obvious, it will cost you a little bit more to get Azure AD Premium with more features. And then you have Azure AD Premium 2, which has even more features. So once you do that, you can also give some advanced security features, such as you can do MFA for your authentication. You can also restrict the number of users and devices that can join Azure AD. We already talked about it. You can basically set a number of users, a number of devices a particular user can join. At the same time, also when you actually join device, it is also a good practice for each user to make sure that if there are any stale devices. What that really means is that if you have a user who has been in your organization for a long time, and maybe that user has been given multiple machines to your corporation, it is very possible that the user exceeds the limit that you set, and there are old stale objects that he never uses, is still in your Azure AD. So you can actually check the attributes when the device was last logged in or last in use. And based on that and your other data from your inventory, you should delete or remove old devices that are currently not in use. Let's now move on to conditional access policies. When you add your devices to your Azure AD, you can control many things using the conditional access policies. You can control access as well as the time for access with conditional access policies. You can set up a policy which says that user and device can only access when they are either in your internal network or they are connected using VPN. And once you set up this type of policy using your conditional access, user needs to be connected to VPN prior to authenticating to your corporate internet. So, which basically means that using their cached credential, the user can still be able to access the device and open the device. But if they are not um, authenticated and connected to VPN, they will not be able to access your corporate intranet, which basically means that your corporate file share or any other application that are hosted in your internal network. To summarize, in this video, we talked about high-level overview of how Azure AD Join works. We also talked about device setting requirement and also how conditional access policies can be used to control access of AD Join devices. So with that in mind, I'm going to pause for Q&A. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. All right. So, we talked a lot about Azure AD and users and all the stuff you can do. So, I thought I'd give you a quick rundown on what it actually looks like. So, here we are in Azure AD. And if you have the question that what is Microsoft Entra? Well, that is the new name for Azure AD for Microsoft. Cloud environment. So Microsoft Entra actually combines not just Azure AD, it also gives the other features such as managing different identities and governance as well as security features. So they combined actually a few different features and services. Within Azure AD, that actually, I wouldn't say within Azure AD, some of these were completely different services, but it worked with Azure AD. So they combined all of it and rebranded it as Microsoft Entra. But we are essentially talking about Azure AD. As you can see from my left hand pane, you have Azure Active Directory or Azure AD. So once you are in Azure AD, let's just look at all the users. So once you click in, you see all the users. In case you're wondering why there are so many users in the same name, in my environment, what I have here is a lot of users that have a Microsoft Exchange online account. I have users that are basically are in a environment that is a hybrid. So it is an environment where some of the application part are in on-premise and some of it is in the cloud, as we talked about. So we talked about creating users using the Azure Active Directory. So I could go in here. And at this moment, the admin users I have do not have permission, but you can use this interface to basically create new users, or you can even invite external users through here. So let's look at one of these users. So when we look at a user, we can see the creation date. We can also see the group membership of the user. We can look at the identity of the user, which is, like I said, this domain's name is Patradex and it is on Microsoft.com. As you can see, the user is a member type of user. Let's look and see if we can find a sorry, I went a little bit higher up. We can find a user that is, I think there could be possibly a user here. I thought that I had a user with my name, but actually, let's look at this particular user. And also, this user is also actually a member type user. So um, now let's look at the groups. So we have all the groups here. And as you can see that some of the groups are created, some of the groups are actually um, created by the admins, but some of the groups are actually automatically created based on the applications. For example, Exchange servers, Exchange trusted subsystem actually are created when Exchange application was integrated with Azure AD. And this is for on-premise. When you are talking about Microsoft Exchange or email application through Microsoft 365, there are no, you will not have any groups called Exchange servers. So let's talk about all groups. And then when we go to this is actually an export. Sorry. So this is the function, new function for Entra where you can download groups. And if you do a download of groups, it actually downloads everything in CSV file, all the information. It doesn't download group. It actually downloads all the information in CSV file, which is really a great feature for any admins. I mean, if you want to have list of all your groups and we want to know what type of groups you have. So when you click this option. Let's see if it does. Okay, yeah. So like I said, like, you have group types, you have security groups, and you have Microsoft 365 groups like we talked about. You can give group name, description, and you can define if the member is assigned. Um, if you remember the presentation, you can have a assigned member, or you can have a dynamic user, or you can have a dynamic device. So let's see what else we talked about. We talked about devices. Let's see. I do not know if I have any devices here. Okay. Oh, actually, I do. This is like my test environment. So, all right. So it looks like there are four stale devices here. So, okay, yeah. So these are like my devices that I added. These are all virtual devices that I created and added here. As you can see, these are all Azure AD registered, not joined, and using Microsoft Intune. And it's saying it's non-compliant because probably I have some rules. I mean, these are virtual machines that I have not updated. But if we click on a device, as you can see that you can actually have a lot of information. Um, if the device is registered, what type of operating system, the versions, as well as who is managing this device. MDM will tell you who is managing this device. MDM stands for Microsoft Device Management. You can look at the roles and administrators for this device. Obviously, Cloud Device Administrator is the administrator for the device. So as you can see from here, you have the device management as well. If you go to protect and secure, here you have this awesome feature that I haven't enabled it for this particular admin, but this is where you go and create conditional access policy. And in future presentation, I'll give a total rundown of conditional access, because seriously, it is like not only one of the most important features, but it is like really an essential part of managing your Azure AD. In addition to conditional access, you have different identity protection features. For example, you can diagnose and solve some problem. Like if you're getting a lot of alerts, you can diagnose and solve it. We talked about user risk policies that you can create. So, for example, if some device is failing to register over and over again and presenting different types of IP addresses, that is a little bit suspicious. So you can create policies around that. A lot of these policies are actually already created. These are like automatic policies that Microsoft has. You just have to just basically enable or activate it for your organization. Similar thing goes for risky users, and same idea. You just have to, if you have a user that is trying to sign in from different IP addresses using different password, timing out the timeout that you have for password reset, all this kind of stuff, then that user is defined as risky user. And you don't have to create all these rules for risky users. Microsoft already has that. Here you can set up different authentication method for your organization, whether it's users or your basically or your devices. So here you'll come in and set up MFA if that is what you want to do. So here, this is a quick rundown of Azure AD and what to expect from Azure. What I would say is that just make sure that you understand different features. And for that particular reason, it is worthwhile to just get a subscription for a month or two of Azure Premium or Premium 2, I guess, gives you access to all the features. Um, and you can, I mean, right before your exam, it's not expensive. Right before your exam, you can just get a Premium 2 subscription. Sometimes they do offer trial, so you can even sign up for trial for free. And usually their trials are anything between 15 days to 3 months. I mean, I've received trials for 3 months, and I can try out subscription for a very long period of time. So I would highly recommend, as you're preparing for your exam, that you create your own your own um, tenant, and you try out these different features so that you're very comfortable with the concept. So with that being said, I am going to stop share for a couple of minutes, or if not less, to basically set up my presentation for the next video. All right, we are back. Let's now talk about role-based access control, also known as RBAC. You'll hear a lot about RBAC when you talk about Azure AD, Microsoft Access with any Microsoft product in general, even with on-premise application. So we'll dive deep into RBAC now. So we'll talk about different features of Azure RBAC, and we'll also try to differentiate between Azure roles versus Azure AD roles, because those two are not the same. So what is role-based access control? So role-based access control basically is, you can think of it as a system or set of rules that are used to determine who can access what type of resources in Azure Resource Manager. It allows for granting access to resources that are managed. So, for example, you can provision a user Joe's access to manage virtual machine, or you can provision another user called Sherry's access to manage databases. All these different types of access are managed by role-based access control. And you can do all these by creating different roles. And we are going to look at that. So before we dive into any of the specific roles, there is a difference between Azure roles versus Azure AD roles. Azure roles are roles that you create to manage resources in Azure. When we talk about resources, a very easy way to understand is, let's just say, virtual machines in Azure. So Azure virtual machines are not same as Azure AD. They are a different resource. So Azure AD is actually, you can think of it as a resource, but it's actually a directory that comes in by default with your Azure organization. However, you can add additional resources. For example, Azure containers, Azure virtual machines. To manage access to those resources, you're going to use Azure roles. So these are different roles that you already have that comes with Azure AD. Azure AD roles are used to manage access to Azure AD resources such as user accounts. It also uses RBAC to manage user and administrator accounts. So it already uses RBAC uh, for built-in administrator roles, but you can also use RBAC to create your custom roles in Azure AD to manage users and administrators. I would also like to add that Azure AD roles are also used to manage completely Azure AD integrated applications such as Microsoft Exchange or Microsoft Teams or SharePoint. You'll see that SharePoint admin role in Azure AD to manage SharePoint resources. So in this video, we talked about RBAC roles and how RBAC roles are used in Azure. We also talked about Azure difference between Azure roles and Azure AD roles. And we also compared the different uses of RBAC roles. All right. Sorry, the transition. Um, So one thing I also want to make sure that you understand that when we are talking about Azure roles, these are roles that are specific to Azure resources, and some of these roles can be um, built in. So for example, if you add a Azure resource of, let's just say, Azure SQL database backend, you'll have some built-in roles, but some of these roles can be completely customized that you create by yourself. For example, you create a virtual machine, and then you can create, you have the virtual machine admin role, but you can create other roles to basically manage your virtual machines in Azure. So we're going to pause a second for Q&A. And at this moment, we don't have any questions, so let's just move forward. So we talked a lot about Azure resources and how roles, RBAC roles are different for Azure resources. So let's now talk about resource group. In Azure, basically, you can have resource group where you have resources. So in this video, we'll talk about what is resource group. Uh, these are used to organize your resources in the cloud. So we'll talk about that. We will also talk about different methods of working across different kind of resource groups. So in other words, how resource groups interact with one another and how you can work with that. So resource group is what we are calling a logical container of resources. So you can actually literally go to Azure. The interface I showed you, that one just had Azure, basically just Azure AD. But in order to create resources, you actually have to buy additional subscription. Once you do that, you will have an option to create a resource group, which is nothing but a logical container. Um, each Azure resource, in order to actually visualize the resource, you can think of it as a virtual machine. It is really easier for me to understand a resource when I say virtual machine. So I'm often going to give virtual machine as an example. So a virtual machine as a resource can only reside to one resource group. And Azure resources also has to be in a resource group. So in other words, you cannot just randomly create virtual machines that don't belong to any resource group. It has to belong to a resource group. And when you delete a resource group, it'll delete all the resources. But you don't need to be afraid. It's like there'll be like many warnings and stuff. And there are also other kind of protection mechanism to make sure that you don't accidentally delete. Let's just say you installed a very critical database as in your resource group. Don't accidentally delete that. So grouping resources, your Azure resource in resource group can vary based on your organization's need. So some of the example of resource organization could be that you put all the virtual network, your virtual machine, virtual networks that connect your virtual machines, and maybe the virtual machine is hosting a database, that particular database virtual machine in one resource group. You can also organize your resource group by departments. So you can have different resource group for different department if you're using similar type of application. I would have to say that I have not um, come across this that much. Usually resource groups are divided based on the type of application. However, type of application can be correlated with departments. So for example, you can have a resource group that has application for your accounting related applications all in one resource group, including the backend database, and perhaps that resource group can be correlated to your finance department. Also, you can have resource group based on the role of whoever is managing the resource. So it can be senior engineer. Maybe there is some resources that are very critical to your entire organization, not necessarily related to particular geographic location. So that can be organized that way. So let's look at the resources, whether or not it can be moved between groups. So as you can see that you have, in this case, you have two different subscriptions. You have resource group 1 and 2. And once the resources to be moved are identified, the users needs to check the limitations that might be imposed on them. So for example, each resource can have dependency. So once you create the resource, if you want to move the resource from one resource group to a different resource group, or a different resource group in a different subscription, you need to move the dependency as well, provided it is basically allowed to be moved. There are certain resources that cannot be moved, like a Azure Backup Vault or certain app service gateways. You once you create the resource in certain resource group, it cannot be moved to a different resource group within the subscription. It definitely cannot be moved to other subscription. So few things to keep in mind. Oftentimes there is a type of thought process that, okay, I'm going to just create resource group and I'm just going to create my resources, and later when I figure out how am I going to manage it, I'm going to move them. But that is not always applicable for all types of resources. So make sure you check your Microsoft documentation to understand which resources can be moved. Let's look at resource tags. Resource tags are kind of like a key or a value that you add to a resource. So, for example, you create a resource and then you can add a tag. So, for example, just like we said, you can create a tag, like you create a virtual machine. In this attribute, you can create a tag called department with the value of finance. So tax can be applied to resources individually, or it can be all the resources in a resource group in a bulk, or it can be added to specific resources. And the resource can have up to 50 tags. Um, and not all types of resources can have tags. Again, it has to be, let's just say there's like, let's just say serverless computing, there is resources such as Kubernetes. All of those do not necessarily support resource tags. Tags are also good for organizing and billing. So for example, you have, let's say, most organizations have different cost centers, and even within your department called finance, you have resources that are possibly can go to different orgs within the finance department, or different cost centers within the finance department. So that is why you can add tags. It is just easier to manage billing, and sometimes it is also easier to manage different types of attributes that you want to track using tags. Let's now talk about management groups. Management groups are containers that hold subscriptions of an organization. This is done so that you can manage multiple subscriptions within the organization. The reason for creating management groups is that you can assign policies that are directly applied at a management group level. So, for example, if you have a policy where, in order to access all the resources under different subscriptions, you have to validate two-factor auth. Instead of going in different subscription or different resource group to add that policy, you can have a management group where you can create a policy and apply that policy, which in turn applies to all your subscriptions and all the resources within that subscription. Needless to say that the users or admins who have access at a management group level will have access to all the subscriptions under that management group. Keep in mind that each management group or subscription can be assigned to only one parent group, whereas one management group can have multiple subscriptions. So the relationship between management group and subscriptions is one to many. So you have a management group in the tenant root. So even though basically if you are trying to create multiple management group, thought process might be there, like I want to create a parent management group for my tenant. That is actually already there. That is your tenant root, which is actually a management group. So the root management group is called tenant root. You cannot move or delete the tenant root. All users can see the root but cannot access or manage it. Okay, and only the global admins can manage the tenant root. And from the tenant root management group, you can create different management group and assign permissions accordingly. Now, keep in mind that you don't have to always have subscriptions within the management group. You can have subscription within your root, and then you have other subscriptions within other management root group as shown in this diagram. So in summary, we talked about resource tagging and how it can be used to organize your relevant resources. And also, resource tagging can be used for billing purposes. We also talked about management groups and how you can use management groups to organize your resources and different subscription. One thing to keep in mind that policies can be applied at management group level, but also can be applied at resource group level. It just depends on what type of policy you are applying. And also keep in mind that management group, resource group, multiple subscription, all of these come to play when the organization gets large and you have multiple offices, geographic locations, etc. These things actually do not apply to organizations that are very small. Let's just say have they can manage everything all within one subscription. So that is also to keep in mind that whenever we are creating these logical groups and different subscription, there has to be a very compelling reason and best practice followed to create those. There are no reason to create multiple resource groups, multiple management groups, and resource tags, and etc. if there is no need. That can actually create unnecessary management overhead. All right. Our next video is cost calculator. I am just going to pause for a second before I start this video. All right, let's talk about cost calculator. So it's all, it's all fine and dandy, as they say, until you get the bill. So how do you actually, let's say you're an administrator and you are presenting a project proposal of moving all your applications in Azure. How do you sell that idea to your management group? What is, first thing they're going to ask is what is involved, what type of cost we are going to incur. Remember, the cost is the monthly bill. So let's look at the Azure cost calculator that Microsoft provides. So we'll review different cost calculators that are available, and we'll also explore how to use the cost calculator. Uh, so Azure has two different kinds of cost calculator. One is the total cost of ownership calculator. Another one is the pricing calculator. Total cost of ownership compares cost between a planned Azure infrastructure and on-premise data center. So you are going to put in your information as in, let's just say you have a on-premise SQL server, which has, a front-end application and three back-end servers, and you want to move it to Azure. So you're going to just do the pricing calculator of which region, operating system, and tier. So tier is going to be actually determined by the application. So, for example, like if it's a SQL, then you're not going to choose standard tier. It's going to be, and you can actually just go through the drop down to see what tier it is. But it actually is very much self-explanatory. Once you go to the cost calculator, you can just put in, you'll just use the drop down to choose your tier. And then it'll tell you what you need to choose if you're installing SQL Server versus just a file share server. So you're going to choose that, and then as you can see, it says in your estimate, it gives you the dollar amount that it's going to cost, that's going to incur every month. Pricing calculator is used to estimate based on your resource or service need. It just it determines cost by analyzing the type of resource, location of the resource, tier of service, and stuff. So pricing is applicable, like for example, you have a application that your third party application, what we call, that you're gonna use the equivalent of it, something that is hosted in Azure. So it can be your a web-based application that is used to maybe determine the different levels of service that your organization provides. Now you want to do that in a Azure hosted environment. So then you are going to do a pricing calculator. And usually that is a little bit more involved. So let's take a look at cost management and billing. So for all of these, cost management is, and there is a suite called cost management and billing. And basically you have a set of tools to manage and analyze cost of cloud resources. So when you get onboarded, Microsoft automatically creates a billing account, and you are going to basically incur cost based on the type of billing account. If you have a EA agreement or enterprise agreement, it creates a different type of billing account in the sense that it actually estimates your billing at first, and then basically it charges you based on your usage, and at the end of the day, end of the year, they do a basically they do a summarize, and they kind of make sure that you are getting your you are getting everything that you paid for, or actually you have something in advance. So in other words, e-agreement is really good for large organizations who already know that, who already have it all planned out, and they already know what they're going to, let's just say they're going to deploy 100 servers within a fiscal year. So if they go through e-agreement, they can actually have a quote unquote better deal with Microsoft because they're going to deploy so much, right? But for a smaller organization, e-agreement is uh, not really feasible, since they'll be, let's just say they'll only plan to deploy 10 or 15 servers, and they really don't know. So it really, they're not going to get any discount even if they want to go with e-agreement. So in that case, um, you have the option of creating a Microsoft customer agreement by going through Microsoft customer representative. So these are the three agreements you have. For most of you, if you want to just play with Azure and you create your own subscription, it is the Microsoft Online Service Program, basically individual billing account created when you sign up for Azure, and specifically you sign up for Azure portal. If you're just signing up for Azure AD, just going into portal.azure.com, at first, like, it's not going to charge you anything because there is a free version that you get. But after that, as you are adding subscriptions and resources, you have to put in a credit card. That is applicable for US only. For international, to be honest, I think I'm not 100% positive, because I know that there are different billing mechanism based on your geographical location and your national, policies and whatnot. But for United States, basically you have to put in a credit card for your individual billing account, and that is oftentimes used for even small to mid-sized companies. They also just use individual billing account to basically pay their bills. And the other thing about, and this is applicable for all types of accounts, is that it does provide you with cost analysis, cost alerts, budget, and cost advisor. So, for example, really cool thing about Azure resource is that, sure, like in the previous like, in the previous slide we showed, like if we go back to the previous slide, that for this virtual machine it is estimates 188.57, but as you use depending on your usage or whatnot, it can be a little bit higher or lower. So what you can do is you can actually set up a budget. Let's just say you set up your budget as $250, but let's just say even that budget is getting used up on the 15th of the month. Then you will, as you get closer, I forget the exact number, but I think like if you are closer, if you have used more than 80% of your budget, you'll get alerts. To summarize, we talked about total cost of ownership calculator, and we also talked about cost incurred in Azure versus on-premise, how TCO calculator works. We talked about accounts for all cost. We talked about also pricing calculator, which is estimate based on your resources and your service need. And the pricing calculator to keep in mind is really a estimate. Ultimately, your pricing calculator um, can vary more so than TCO, because TCO is really easy to understand. It's basically a calculator for migrating resources directly to Azure, also known as lift and shift. So TCO, you can think of it more applicable for lift and shift, but pricing calculator is like you're building a um, new application in Azure. With that in mind, we have reached end of day one for this particular course for preparing for AZ-104 exam. I really appreciate those of you who are hanging in there. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to hang in here for a few more minutes. If not, we'll see you tomorrow. All right. Looks like we have a question, and the question is management group similar to AWS's organization, tenant root to AWS root user regarding multiple subscription? It seems their calculators are the same. I'm being absolutely honest here. I am not super familiar with AWS infrastructure, so I have to look up and give your answer later. Based on what you're saying, it does seem same, but I'm being absolutely honest here. I don't know for sure due to my focus is on Azure. I'm not 100% familiar with the AWS's infrastructure, so I'll have to look it up and let you know later. But thank you for asking the question. All right. What I'm going to do before we conclude for the day, I will just quickly demo something called Cyber Vista, which is a Cybrary resource we have for practice test. And actually, every day I'm going to kind of go over it to see how we can utilize this resource. Just so you know that this is a resource that you can utilize for your practice exam when you have when you're using Cybrary subscription. However, you can use other practice tests as well. Um, so without further ado, let's just look at Cyber Vista. All right. Okay. Have a question, which is to take exam, does one have to have practical knowledge of these topics? By practical knowledge, I'm assuming um, the learner is asking that do you need to have hands-on experience? Do you have to actually create users and conditional access policies to understand everything? In the exam, they will not, I mean, there are some simulations, but they will not ask you to do those things. Um, so, in theory, you can actually sit for the exam and pass the exam without really having any hands on experience. However, like I said, that it is complex enough that I think that if you have some practical experience, it'll be much easier to absorb the knowledge and much easier to actually, even if you are kind of memorizing some of the topics per se, because sometimes we do have to if it's a theoretical knowledge, we do have to kind of memorize, like, let's just say, I mean, I just said like you can maximum have 50 tags. I mean, this number has to be kind of like you have to read few times to make sure that you know it. But I think that it'll be much easier if you just actually experience the way I showed you real quick, the different types of groups, like there's a drop down list. It just makes it so much easier to understand and absorb the knowledge. So I would highly recommend having the hands on experience um, prior to taking this exam, especially as we move forward with some of the complex topics. So let's look at the Cyber Vista. So here you have basically a AZ-104 exam simulation. Let me see if I can go back. So it gives you basically a quick quiz or a custom quiz option. Let's look at the custom quiz option. So it has all these different types of topics. So let's just say we went over Azure Identity and Governance. So I just select this topic, all questions, and you can do unused previously. And I just do, like, let's just say I just want to do 10 questions, right? Quiz, I just do both, give you answer explanation, and then let's launch the quiz. Okay, so where should the auditors go to find information to budget of the next quarter? Let's just say that I just go in here, but actually, as soon as you do that, it tells me my answer is incorrect. And good thing is, like, it gives you the explanation, right? You should view the invoices by navigating under. The correct answer is subscription blade, choose subscription, choose invoices. So this is the correct answer, and it actually gives you the explanation where you should go, and it even gives you a very handy um, cost analysis, like a screenshot, like what the question is about and what it is about. And this, I think, indirectly actually answers the question of the do you need to have practical experience? Because when you see this, like if there's no like you'll remember this when you when you become familiar with this interface. And as we move forward, I'll try to do more demo of the interface. I did one today. As we move forward, I'll come back to this interface more often as time permits. So let's look at the next question. So the organization has a tenant with following identities. So I'm not actually using all that. Which identity can be added to the security group? Name this. So let's just say I just do that and I do check answer. And then basically it is giving me the explanation of the answer. So I just wanted to take a this quick opportunity to demonstrate the Cyber Vista feature that is available with Cybrary accounts. It is really helpful to take practice exams. We'll talk more about questions and whatnot in our upcoming videos, type of questions to expect and how to study. You can also go to learn.microsoft.com, and they have some reading materials, and after each material there's some questions. I'll have to warn you, those questions are relatively easy, to be honest. Actual exam questions are a little bit more difficult, kind of like the question you're seeing here right now. This is more on par with what you can expect in the exam. So either way, I think that having no matter which interface you choose, I think having practice exam that gives you the explanation of the right and wrong answer is really helpful in terms of prepping for the exam. So with that being said, have a wonderful day. Thank you again for sticking with me in this live event. I've really enjoyed doing this presentation and answering few questions. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow, where we will talk about the awesome topic of networking. So thank you.